Global maritime trade will plunge by 4.1% this year due to the unprecedented disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, according to UNCTAD's flagship Review of Maritime Transport, published on 12 November. Now, such a decline has ramifications for the global economy because around 80% of the goods traded internationally is carried by sea. Today, we're unpacking the pandemic's impact on maritime transport and what the new normal could look like for the industry with Jan Hoffmann, Chief of UNCTAD's Trade Logistics Branch. Before we get into the details of UNCTAD's analysis, could you briefly explain what we're talking about when we say maritime trade and maritime transport?
Yeah, maritime trade, that is 80% of the volume of all international trade. Whether you put fuel in your car or eat a meal in a restaurant or buy a new smartphone, there's a very high likelihood that this good you consume traveled on a ship. So in 2019, there were 11 billion tons of seaborne trade. That's from our review. That's, I calculated just for you, 1,450 kilogram per year for every human on Earth, children, adults, developing countries. 1,450 kilo for each one of us. So a lot of this is actually not a final produced product we consume, but this includes iron ore shipped from Brazil to China to build your smartphone, or fertilizers from Malaysia to the Netherlands to grow your tulips, or a wide range of big and small components that are shipped across oceans to be assembled in your new car. So maritime trade really includes both the final product and also the raw materials and components along the supply chain. So some more numbers perhaps of interest. So in 2020, there are 98,140 ships in our database. Those are manned by about 2 million seafarers and other seagoing personnel. In terms of maritime trade, developing countries have a growing share in both loaded and unloaded goods, imports and exports. Or loaded are the exports and unloaded the imports. So more than 2/3 of the seaborne trade are developing countries' imports. Now, this includes consumer goods, but also that are then used to produce manufactured goods for export. So that's all a bit of it, some data, some linking it to what you think when we speak about maritime trade and its transport, maritime transport.
Thanks, Jan, for the explanation and the very concrete examples. So now, UNCTAD estimates that global maritime trade will decline by 4.1% this year, primarily due to the effects of the pandemic. Now, how is originally a health crisis affecting maritime trade?
Yes, correct. For 2020, we project a decline of about 4.1%. And for next year, depending very much on how the pandemic and growth develops, a certain rebound of perhaps plus 4.8, 4.9%. It's a range. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on maritime transport is really threefold. So first, the numbers, there's the impact on demand. There's less consumption, less production, so there's less demand to ship the goods and use our ports. But this negative impact is actually not quite as bad as it was, for example, the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, as most of the decline in economic activities this time is in services and domestic activities. So seaborne trade did not decline quite as much as one could have expected from past experience. But yes, the decline we expect it's quite significant. The second impact of COVID-19 on shipping is the direct impact on the operations of ships and ports. Like any business, many factories had to close, restaurants, hairdressers all have to close. So ports and ships actually kept running. They kept moving goods. So ports and ships had to adjust to protect their workers, population from the pandemic. And on the ships, in particular the seafarers, the people working in ships, they have been hit quite hard. So there's currently an ongoing crewing crisis. That's how we call it, the crisis of the crews, the people who work on ships. That has left many seafarers stuck on the ships without possibilities to go home to their families. By the same token, seafarers that were on leave when the crisis hit, they are now stuck at home with their families who may or may not be happy to have the husbands and wives at home. They are unemployed and cannot go back to their ships. So we at UNCTAD, as we speak, we're actually collaborating with some member states of the UN. That's an initiative led by Indonesia towards a resolution of the UN General Assembly that supports that seafarers are declared key workers and thus given preferential access and permits to travel, allow for the crew changes. So that's a second impact. The first one was on the demand. Second is really on the operations of the ports and the ships. Then there's a third impact, more positive, more long-term, which is that there are now reforms taking place in the ports, in the customs, in the shipping companies, private sector, public sector, that promote further digitalization, modernization, reforms, automation. There are many measures that we have promoted for many years, including programs at UNCTAD, ASICUDA, Trade Information Portals, Port Reform Program, all types of digitalization, automation. So these are promoted and move forward more than before the crisis. And that is something which, like for the medium or long term, could actually make us optimistic in the sense that, once and if and when we hope that the economy rebounds, the ports and shipping and customs are actually ready to move even faster and smoother to transport our maritime trade.
Now, Jan, you've said that UNCTAD expects maritime trade to see positive growth in 2021. Right now, many parts of the world are living through a second wave of the pandemic. So would you say that ports, carriers, and other players in the industry are better prepared right now than they were for the first wave?
I think so. And I actually think we have made our little contribution to this. We have a number of projects where we were lucky we could jump on a rolling train with ongoing projects, which I just explained earlier. This push towards more digitalization reform. So with ASICUDA, with trade facilitation, with transport, with port reforms, we have really helped countries to go for those reforms. And now, one way to put it, in a maybe catchy phrase, we need to lock in the progress made during lockdown. No? So there has been progress made, and once you have invested and built the capacity to be faster, to be better connected, that's definitely something positive. There's in this context, one point I really want to highlight. When you talk about these reforms, and especially thinking about a pandemic, a health crisis, people present or show a balance as if there was a trade-off between either facilitating trade or protecting the population from illicit trade or under-declaration or weapons or drugs or the pandemic. In reality, all the programs and measures we are proposing, we also have a 10-point action plan that was already before the review, but we very much work along those lines also in our RMT. So all the measures we propose, and also all the measures that are included, for example, in the WTO trade facilitation agreement, they all achieve both. If you take pre-arrival processing, electronic submission, electronic payment, single windows, more transparency, automation, risk management, all these measures help achieve both. They make trade and transport easier, and they protect the population. I think this is something where we really hope to see, and we think we see, a positive development, and think that our member countries have seen this. So that's one point in terms of the impact, whether the industry is ready. Second point, when you ask what would it mean, like what is this new normal, there has been talk about more local procurement, more near-shoring. we don't really know yet, or at least I don't know. I see more a diversification. So you don't want to depend on only one supplier, be it of goods or be it of shipping services or ports. You really want to diversify. That is one of the ways you can have a more resilient supply chain. And a third point I want to highlight is really the need for coordination, the mutual recognition of standards, of not protecting only your population. If everybody limits the export of certain goods or uses trade facilitation or the opposite of trade facilitation, like obstacles to protect only your population, then in the end the whole benefit as much as it should be. So there's a need also for coordination in transit, in information exchange, in mutual recognition, authorized economic operators, a number of solutions. So I think, yeah, this is among the actions that make the industry more ready. We hope they are more ready now after the pandemic for, we hope, a revival of the economy and again, positive growth of seaborne trade.
And Jan, besides focusing strongly on the impact of the pandemic, the report provides data on performance indicators for international seaborne trade and the maritime sector. What are some of the key trends for 2020?
Yeah, no, really, we have a wealth of data. And apart from in this review focusing a lot on what does the pandemic mean, what could be the implications, we continue our regular updates on the fleet, on the port traffic, and we have actually some additional parts this year, which I find particularly interesting. We have a number of novel indicators about the ports, including from our own UNCTAD port management program, where we have access to data from the ports that are members of the network. You can really have raw data that is shared with us confidentially, so we don't always report about individual ports, but a lot of interesting insights. And we have data from other data providers on port calls, on the time ships spent in port. So, for example, we see that container ships spend 3 times less time in port than a dry bulk carrier. And you can look up your country's data in our review and in our online statistics. So you can really see how long do dry bulk carriers, oil tankers, container ships, ferries, how long do they spend in my country's ports? And when we analyze this data, here we do see to some extent a trade-off. You remember earlier I did not like the trade-off between either I facilitate trade or I protect my population. Here we have a trade-off between, on the one hand, I want economies of scale. I do see that if there are more port calls, if there are bigger ships, there are more containers loaded, unloaded in one port call, all this is positively correlated with performance. On the other hand, if I have bigger ships, this also means I tend to have fewer companies in the market. I tend to have less frequency and I tend to have less competition, less choice for the shipper. So here, the smaller countries, and we have a special section also on SIDS, the small island developing states, they are really not benefiting from some of these trends, from these growing ship sizes, the alliances among shipping lines, the consolidation. They are stuck in a vicious circle at times where you don't have the volume, so ships don't come too often, and if they don't come too often, you're not very competitive, and if you're not competitive, you don't export and import that much. So our hard data on shipping connectivity shows that the SIDS, most of the SIDS are really stuck and are not advancing with their shipping connectivity, whereas the global average and the majority of countries, they do advance. We monitor and observe the connectivity divide. So all this is from a number of different data sets, very fascinating, I find, on ports, time in port, frequency, connectivity, and so on. Then there's one other data set still under KPIs, as you asked, which is also novel, new in this year's review, which covers the issue of decarbonization. It's the CO2 emissions of ships. So with data that comes from AIS, from satellite data, you can actually assign how much CO2 was emitted from any individual ship at any point in time. It depends on its speed, on the technology, on fuels, many aspects. But like this, we can actually assign emissions to countries. So you can say which countries, for example, by flag state, is emitting more CO2 and which one is emitting less CO2. And I think this is one contribution to the whole discussion about the decarbonization of maritime transport, because at some point in time, as the listener certainly have heard, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, has very clear targets about reducing emissions from shipping. And we collaborate with the IMO on a number of projects, and we also want to support this, for example, with this type of statistics data that we have in the review. And we want to expand further to really know what makes, what leads to some countries emitting more than others. And then, of course, the next step would be what can be done to reduce those emissions also from shipping. Thanks.
Thanks. So UNCTAD has just published its review of Maritime Transport 2020, and we've been discussing how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted maritime trade and the maritime transport industry with Jan Hoffmann, Chief of UNCTAD's Trade Logistics Branch.